I'm trying to think of someone who's used disability as a platform to be elected. Like, is that,
Yeah.
it
You
doesn't
would-
come up often.
It doesn't. You would think it would.
All right, you ready?
Sure,
Ready to roll?
sure thing.
All right. Well, welcome to the Disability Rights Montana podcast. My name's Kona,
And I'm David.
and today we are going to talk a little bit about voting and how our office supports people with disabilities to vote, and just some general information around voting, a bit of a primer as we go into the voting as we get closer to November. But there's lots of voting actions that will happen between now and November. But this is just the first bit about voting in general, people voting, who can vote, and yeah. So maybe that's a good place to start in terms of who, in general, disability aside, like who's able to vote, who's a voting person in the United States.
No, usually if you're over 18, that's sort of the big marker, right? Like, now we're talking about government votes, right? Like you could have a vote in your classroom or a vote in your household. Like voting's just one means of making decisions. So for the government, 18, that's a good place to start. But then there are some state rules or laws that can put some slight modifications on that.
So 18 years old, and if you turn 18, you just have to be 18 by election day.
Correct.
So you can be 17 in August and 18 in November and vote.
Register so that you're ready to vote on that day. And if you live in a jurisdiction that has same day registration, great, but why chance it? Just register. So high school seniors out there who are not quite 18 yet, juniors who are going to be 18 by the time November 5th rolls around, start registering now. That's the way to do it. Or if you're like me, and you just move to the state, register, because it doesn't just automatically follow you from one state to another. So yeah.
And while we're on that topic, it doesn't necessarily follow you from one address to another within the same state.
So that's another thing. A lot of times people are like, oh, I'm registered, but are you registered in your local jurisdiction so you can vote on the issues in your town? Because your ballot will be generated by where you used to live, and it won't have the Helena judges on it. It'll have Missoula judges if that's where you came from, and you can't be voting on Missoula judges if you don't live in Missoula. So absolutely update your voter address when you move so that your ballot reflects where you live and you can legally vote on the issues in your area.
So that's who can vote fairly broadly, high level. Now, you had mentioned voting at there's different scales of voting. Federal government is probably the one that most people in the nation that gets a lot of coverage. Presidential election.
Right. We got a presidential election this year, so you're going to hear way more about voting this year, but we vote every year and sometimes multiple times a year. You don't hear about it as much, but you will be hearing about it a lot.
And so federal government, presidential election is kind of the top of the, I don't know if you want to call it voting food chain or whatever, like the top of the hierarchy, most in charge person in our country. All the way down to county, like we live in Lewis and Clark County here in Montana, and there are city and county commissioners that you can vote on as well in like one of the smallest, I guess, not the smallest census block, but like a small area that you can vote in.
Right.
Like,
you could live in I say jurisdiction, that's very lawyerly. You could live in an area, in a place that has a public utility district that operates a shared well, and it's its own little government. We think of governments as cities, counties, states, federal government, but there are many other entities that take government action. And so you would have an opportunity to vote on those individuals. You have an opportunity to vote on a variety of types of decision makers who decide how things are going to be done collectively for all of us. And a lot of those don't have a lot of voters around it and a lot of people running for it. So we're talking about voting, but also be thinking in the back of your head, how many people live in this town that actually be running for this thing? I'd probably be better than most of them, so maybe you should be running.
And I'll try to find a picture. And if you're listening to this or watching it online, I'll try to find a picture of either I'll put it in the video or I'll put a link to it below to just give a visual description of the lines that we draw around areas to determine who votes where. So if we talk about, the county that we're in right now, Lewis and Clark County, within the county, let's take another subset of voters. There are different school districts within our county.
Yep.
And those school districts also, if we look at a map, are going to have lines around where you go to high school, and then it gets smaller as where you go to middle school, and then it gets smaller as where you go to elementary school. And then those schools are bulked together in certain groups, and there's lines. So there are geographically defined areas that you vote. So you could be voting on many different scales based on your one location.
Absolutely. You may live in Helena and vote on Lewis and Clark County issues because your city is in the county. You will also get to vote on city issues because you live in the city, and you'll get to vote on school district issues that are relevant to your school district. And so, because there are school districts board members that people vote for and get elected, and and each of those tracks on something that's called a precinct. So the state is divided up into counties, but within counties, there's tiny little areas. They might be just the size of a couple city blocks, or if they're in a rural area, it might be a very large, as big as a city. Depends on how many people live in that particular area. And those precincts are also used for deciding sort of those larger boundaries. We'll group these precincts together to make this collective group that then will vote on different issues, whether it's school board elections or city council. So that's why that address thing is really important. You're like, well, I didn't leave the county. I'm still in the county. It's like, well, that you may still now have an entirely different set of people to vote on for very local things. Obviously, the federal and the state and the county are still going to be the same, but city and school district may have changed. You may say, I just moved to Miles City. That's just like right out of town from Helena for anyone who's not around Helena. But you're actually just right over the border in another county. So all of your from county on down has changed. And so those distinctions are...
Helena's a good example of that because Helena in Montana is on the southern end of Lewis and Clark County, and we border Jefferson County just to the south of us. And so there are many people who live in Jefferson County just drive the 1 mile, 2 miles into Helena to work. Because Helena is, as a city, is the closest city center. So you could be close. You could be close to a border, and that will greatly affect where you vote and the outcomes of those votes, how that affects you.
And we are on the very southern edge of Lewis and Clark County, and the very northern edge is very far north. And so we're all voting for the same county issues. Mm-hmm. So I imagine if you live very far north in a very rural area of Lewis and Clark County, you feel like, well, what's the point? Because all those votes down there in the south end are going to drive things. And that is an important thing to be honest about as someone who's lived in parts of states that are not the population center, that are not the capital of the state. You feel like, well, all the political power, all the numerical voting power is somewhere else. What's the point of being engaged? But when recognizing there's a wide variety of things to be voting on, and you may not vote the same way as everybody somewhere else, but you are voting the same way as some of the people in that other area. So you're adding your support to whatever side you are supporting on whatever issue. If it's should we raise taxes or not raise taxes for this issue or that issue, or should we be electing this person to be a county commissioner or that person? And often those types of seats can also be geographically defined. Not always. Every area has its own way of approaching that, but that could be something that you are really interested in. You say, I'd really like to see better geographic representation and distribution of power in our state or our county or our city. So I'd like to have precincts vote geographically for representation, not as a whole. Or an important issue for you is let's not do majority vote is the one that wins, but we will do a distributed vote where you vote for your top three, and the people who get the most of those are, and it's distributed across proportionally how many votes people get, not winner takes all, but winners take their portion. And so there are different ways of voting. We started talking about who can vote, what is voting. There are places experimenting in the United States with other types of ways of counting votes and giving weight to individual voters' voices.
But right now it is in our
Yes.
current system.
Yep. Majority takes all.
If
Yep.
you win the majority, you win the vote. And
Except there are some, I don't know if we have this here in Montana. I just left Washington State, and to raise taxes, some tax raises you have to have by supermajority. So they put the threshold there at 60%. And in order to raise a new tax, you have to get 60% of the vote, not just 50. And so that's a variation on majority takes all. It's super majority takes all. It's not that proportional voting I was talking about before, but it also isn't a bare majority of 50% plus one vote.
so you mentioned this, it's all relative. You mentioned city centers, rural areas, and we are specific to Montana here. So Helena to Montana feels like a city center. It is a city center for our state. It's a bit funny to say that if you have lived outside of Montana, Montana has a little over 1 million people in the entire state. That's probably 800 miles wide by 400 miles tall or something like that. So if you look at the state as a whole, very low population density. And but the city centers are what we call city centers. Just, it is our city. Where, if you're coming from Seattle, Helena's not going to feel like a city, might feel like a village, but it is our city centers. Now, the geographic areas that are drawn, those are the term for that would be your district. So you may fall in a certain district, and those districts are drawn up and redrawn every, I think, 10 years here in certain areas. So for most elections, and they do determine a lot about who votes for what, who votes with what group of people.
Right.
And you can start to see how, we talked about rural areas and city centers, but you can start to see how housing and where you're allowed to live or can live starts to affect who's voting for what in what area. And that is a whole nother kind of conversation.
Yeah, I was just I called out Bozeman on one of our earlier podcasts. I'll call him out again today because I was just down there yesterday. And that's the elephant in the room, right? Like, we've got a lot of wealth concentrated in certain areas. We've got a lot of universities in particular areas and not other areas. We've got a lot of ag business in other areas. So we are a diverse state. Like you talked about, we have only 1 million people, but really diverse 1 million people of, coming from different perspectives, and they are sort of grouped in different ways, and the needs of people who live in far, far east, right along North Dakota, I imagine are going to be very different than the people who live up in St. Regis right next to Idaho. And there will also be similarities and things that there are some shared values and things that they care about. So those districts are important so that you can elect people more locally to send to, the state legislature or to represent you in your city or county, so that you aren't always, well, the Bozeman people are going to get their way or the Helena people are going to get their way. It's like, well, maybe in their time they get their way in their place, but here in our neck of the woods, they aren't voting for what's going on in the Flathead Valley, or they're not voting for what's going on up in the North Line and what kind of supports we need or what kind of new policies we need in place. So that localization, a blend of everyone's voting for president, and then everyone votes for the 2 senators, and then now we have 2 representatives, and we split the state for that. So some of you are voting for that one, and some of you are voting for that one. And then we go, smaller still to your state representatives and your state senators, and then your local governments. So we have ways that we collectively vote together, and then we have ways that we try and take care of our local areas.
And you had mentioned how diverse we are in our state in terms of the voting population. And regarding disability, so about 25% of Montana adults, which is people over 18, identify as having a disability. This number is a pretty big number when you think about
that
voting.
Alone is big, right? But I think the number could be even bigger because you said identify as having a disability, and we've had other. If you haven't seen them yet, check out some of the other ones around disability identity and social model versus medical model. Disability is a pervasive identity. It cuts across all economic classes, all racial and ethnic groups. It cuts across all genders. Disability is everywhere.
Yeah, so whether you find yourself in Malta or in Bozeman or in Colstrip or in Kalispell, St. Regis, wherever across the state, there's going to be disability in your area. I mean, we've talked about this before. The odds are you know someone with a disability as just a human living in the world. Odds are you or your close circle, there's someone with a disability. Now, the number I threw out there in terms of people who identify, that was from some census information, and people who identify as having a disability. The important part is that people with disabilities are across our entire state, no matter what town you're living in.
This may seem like an odd pivot, but then when you start looking at different places in our state, you started with who can vote, and a lot of times people think if you have a criminal record, you can't vote, or if you have a felony on your record, you can't vote, or you have to jump through certain hoops in order to vote. But in Montana, actually, the reality is, so long as you're not currently being held for a felony in prison, you can vote. So you may have previously, at one point, been held in prison for a felony, or you may have been held in a local detention center jail for a misdemeanor, or you may currently be in a local jail because you're awaiting charges or you are serving a misdemeanor sentence. And all of those, besides the in prison for a felony to vote, you can vote. So when you look at disability in jails, you're looking at over 40% have mental illness, over 60% have substance use disorders, over 40% have other disabilities. So, and then obviously that's more than 100%. Some people have more than one of those identities, but you've got, over half of the people in jails have disabilities. But I bet you most of the people in those jails and most of the people running the jails don't know, oh yeah, you still have the right to vote because you're in jail, not in prison. And we should get you your ballot. You can vote and that's where a lot of people with disabilities, you just need to make sure you're registered, because if you thought, oh, I had this felony, I'm not going to register to vote anymore because that would be illegal. No, you can register to vote. And even if you're in jail currently, you can vote.
The other group of people that there's questions sometimes about who can vote are people who are unhoused or homeless people.
Right.
If you're without housing, you can still vote. Yeah, that right's not taken away from you.
Absolutely. And there are you can establish your residence in wherever you are residing. If you typically spend your time in Helena, then that's where you would register. You may have previously had a house in Billings, but if you live in Helena, just like I currently live in Helena, that's then where I'm going to vote.
25% of Montana adults with this identify as having a disability, and that's people over 18, so they can vote.
Yeah.
They cross all spectrums of other identities. That as a chunk of like a voting block is huge. And so why I'm trying to think of someone who's used disability as a platform to be elected. Like, is that, it doesn't come up often.
It doesn't. You would think it would. I think there are two big reasons. And I only organically came up with one of them. The other one was spoon-fed to me at a training. The first one, the organic one, is I think there's a lot of stigma around disability and people don't see it as a strength. And so if they're like, I want to run for office and I'm going to hide my disability. Like, I did not tell people that I was dyslexic or neurodiverse or any of that. When I was in law school, when I was the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, who's going to make, because you vote on who should be the editor-in-chief, all of the members, who is going to vote for the dyslexic kid to be the head of the law review? That doesn't make any sense. The law review is this academic journal where you edit all the writing of these professionals and publish it together. And it's like, that seems to be a bad idea. It's not. It's a good idea. We can have a whole different podcast about that. But I hid that until I had enough privilege that I felt like, oh no, I now can prove I can do a good job at what I do, and I can talk about that. Well, how many politicians feel like they're in a position that I can share that aspect of it? You see a few nationally, not many. Anything that's perceived as a weakness, even something as simple as stuttering. And I'm not trying to minimize stuttering. I'm just saying, well, where's the thought that you'd be a bad leader or not be able to make good decisions because you stutter? It prevents you from speaking, fluidly.
And that stigma does go back to the social model when you said you're perceived as being weak because of this difference or because of this this piece about an individual that others maybe just aren't as educated on or don't know about. It's just different. It's something that is different. You just or people aren't exposed to it, or people are uncomfortable talking about it. It's not bad.
Right. So there's that, right? Like, it isn't bad, and it actually helps you see the world from a different perspective than a lot of the other candidates who are running, who maybe haven't had to think about or navigate the world in a way that is all that different from those who are currently in power, but maybe very similar to the average person walking down the street and is like, I've got that too, or I know someone who thinks or walks or talks that way too, and that doesn't make them a worse leader. Sometimes it makes them a better leader. Then the other issue that I think drives why you don't see it being used as a platform for, in our modern day of identity politics, like, this is where I'm coming from with my lived experience and its disability, is we don't poll disability. While it is a huge voting block, pollsters don't ask identity. When they ask your identity in polls, disability is not one of the identities they're asking.
It's not a sexy question to ask.
No. And so they're asking, like, what are the most important issues for, mothers age 25 to 45? And they will ask that question, but they're not asking, well, what are the most important issues for disabled students 18 to 27? Mm-hmm. And so they're not asking that large in their large polls and then pulling that data out to report to politicians that this is what the disability community wants to see from you. So that also means not only do politicians not run on it as, I know about that, I'm good at that because I've lived that, they also don't pander to, make false promises to our community. They don't really try to get our vote when they should be, because 25% is, think about when you see these national polls about how many Republicans and Democrats are out there. You're usually seeing around 20, 22, sometimes up to 25% are in each of those camps, and then you got a lot of independents in the middle. Well, if our community is already as big as one of the only two major parties, then we've got a lot of voting power if we think about it that way, and we can communicate it in a way that politicians start thinking about it that way.
And that 25% within our state, they are, the diversity in there in terms of political party is also diverse. Like, that's not right. One or the other. Like,
absolutely.
Disability is not a partisan issue. It just is what you are. And if we think about these numbers, the question that comes up is, how many people who are in public office, who are elected to an office, how many elected officials have disability? And right now, like, I guess I'm not even sure I could name someone out of the 150 Montana legislators. Like, if 25% of all of Montanans have disability, could I say that a legislator has a disability? Like, the numbers person to me says, yes, there has to be some percentage out of 150 people
of them should, right?
have a disability. Whether or not they say I have a disability, that's a whole nother, that's a hurdle.
Could I put then, I'll put it as a challenge. I was going to say, is a challenge too much? No, I'll put it as a challenge. Like, could we get a Montanan legislator who's thinking through, maybe seeing this video because a constituent from their district sent it to him and said, hey, look at this, cool. Disability people vote, pay attention to us. And in doing it, they watched a couple of our other videos around social model, medical model of disability, how to talk about disability in the workplace. And they're thinking, I've got a disability. I didn't ever really identify that way, but I do. And it does guide how I approach the world. And in doing so, guides how I work in the legislature. Come on our podcast. We'll interview you. We're right here in Helena, but we can come to you. We can do it Zoom. Or next time you're in town. We'd love to talk about how disability shows up in the legislature. Again, this is not a political thing. This is, I'll throw it out there because I get asked this a lot. Like, you're a civil rights lawyer from the West Coast. Like, you're like highly political. It's like, I work for people with disabilities, and no political party has our back. I cannot say I'm guaranteed to get what I need out of this party or that party, or our issues are issue driven, not sort of dogma or political sides driven. And so I would love to have that conversation about how disability shows up in your thinking about how you govern and how you relate to your constituents. I mean, those are the like hearing it from, the actual people who are out there living it. And if you're a constituent who understands and appreciates and really is vocal about how, or wants to be vocal going forward about how your disability impacts the things you vote for, I'd love to interview you too. Like, how does your lived experience with Medicaid unwinding, or how does your lived experience with the special education system impact how you decide who to vote for school board positions or for the governor? Like, those would be great things to hear more about. On that note, I'd like to plug something coming up pretty soon. March is Developmental Disability Awareness Month nationally. And the governor is going to be holding an event to recognize that month on Tuesday, March 19th at the Capitol Rotunda. So you can show up in Helena. If you're already in Helena, it's easy. If you're not, if you want to be, maybe I'll, if anyone comments below like, oh, they can't, but they'd like to be, maybe I'll live stream from the event. I don't know. We'll figure out what's appropriate with the decorum in the rotunda, but we'll figure out a way to connect you all to the governor issuing some public statements, making a presentation around the importance of Montanans with developmental disabilities and their contribution to our state. And so there's a whole program. There's going to be dancing and speakers. And so come on out there. I'll be out there with voter registration materials. So whether you have a developmental disability or not, you can register to vote. And that's coming up again on March 19th at 12:30 at the Capitol Rotunda.
And so we participate in events. And what are some other ways that our organization, which, by the way, we are a nonpartisan organization. And what other ways are we supporting people with disabilities? We have some funding that supports people supports voting issues directly. And so one of those ways I know is monitoring. So we go around and monitor.
So by that, we can basically wander around any place there are people with disabilities. So that's the state psychiatric hospital. That is a jail or a prison for voting. Again, in Montana, we would not go to a prison because if you are in prison for a felony, you cannot vote. But we would go to a jail. We would go to a psychiatric hospital, and we would go to a nursing home or a homeless shelter. There are going to be lots of people with disabilities and other people who don't have disabilities, all of whom have the right to vote and should be able to vote.
We can also monitor polling places
Absolutely.
that are designed for voting.
And to make sure that they're accessible, that people can get in and cast their ballots or get in and, ask questions beforehand, make sure they get the voter materials, that the voter materials are in accessible formats.
And one of the pieces, too, that we're going to try to put together between now and November specifically is a candidate forum.
Yeah.
And whether that's in something we send to candidates or see if we can get candidates either on this podcast or record interviews with them on Zoom or on video conferencing, just to get some more information, disability specific information, questions that we have as a disability community about as Montana grows, as as more people are moving here and our state is more connected with other states and other countries, like how are we growing? How are we supporting people with disabilities? If you're a person with a disability and you also just need information, something else we can do is offer that too. So if you call our office, we can offer information and referral for how to go about registering, how to go about voting, how to, like, if you are new to this or you need a refresher, or maybe you haven't voted in a decade and you want to vote now, that's okay to get, it's not too late to vote.
Well,
if you are alive and over 18.
One thing that may come up is that there might be someone in your life who says you can't vote or shouldn't vote. And if that's the case, let us know. Like, a lot of people think that if you have a guardian, you can't vote. Was that one of the things I said earlier? No, that wasn't one of the things that I said earlier. Like, if the only way is that you could remove someone's right to vote if they're not in prison for a felony would be because a judge made a specific order removing your right to vote.
And it has to say,
yes,
in that, for example, in the guardianship paper, it has to say, basically, you are not allowed to vote.
Right. It is a separate finding. It is not just, oh, you need to have a guardian, but a court has to independently say, and I do not believe you're mentally fit to vote. Those are the two: mental fitness, a court order about your mental fitness to vote, not just generally. And so not just, oh, you need involuntary treatment to get better for a mental illness, or, oh, you need a guardian, so therefore you should not be able to vote. But a court could, and it's pretty rare, but they do, issue an order specific to that. But short of that, you're 18 and you're not in prison, you can vote. So if someone's getting in your way, or you're just asking for, like, could I have this in Braille, or could I have it in an audio format, or some other way to read or access the material that's already in writing, whether that's the ballot or they'll issue a voter's pamphlet that describes
in
the different
Montana,
things.
there's that voter information
Yeah.
guide that
Yeah.
most Montans are familiar with. It's a kind of like a telephone paper type book. And if you need that in another format, that'd be...
If you have a developmental disability and when you were going to school they did not teach you to read, you can still vote, but you can have an audio format of that material sent to you so you can hear it. And if you are in a setting that does not have access to the internet and Facebook and all of people's opinions about how you should vote on this or that, talk to us. We'll try to think of some other ways to get you access to the information you need to make the informed choices around how you're going to vote.
And we'll leave some links below to how, like, where to find some of this information on your own too. So some of that information and referral that we would give in a call, we'll also leave that here below. So in Montana, the Secretary of State's office over in the Capitol is the kind of the central location, the hub of voting for our state. The Secretary of State's also an elected official that you vote for. And so we'll leave that information below. The SOS office it's often described as the SOS office, Secretary of State's office, has a lot of great information.
Absolutely. And you were just over there talking with them.
Yep.
and other local elected election officials.
Yeah, 3 of us went to the county election administrators conference, and we there was 3 of us, and then another individual that talked about disabilities as well. And they're doing great work over there. They want to be accessible. Like, these county election administrators they're there, and they're trying to do what they can to get people voting, and they're doing what they can to make sure it's done as accurately as possible. And it's interesting. There are a lot of different ways to vote as well. Maybe that's the last thing we can talk about quickly before we wrap up here.
Sure.
Is yes, we can vote, but voting doesn't come in just one way. We've talked about, how do you vote if you're in jail? How do you vote if you are in a really rural place, or you can't, so you don't have transportation, you can't drive? There's multiple ways of voting. You can vote in person on voting day, which is typically the biggest headache. It's like the biggest bottleneck is voting in person on voting day. That's going to be the highest stress level for most people who have other priorities and busy lives. But voting opens up pretty early. Voting opens up, weeks before you can go to the courthouse and vote.
It doesn't have that fun feeling of, oh, I got to fight all these other people to get in. But it's done. And you're like, oh, it's done. It's kind of anticlimactic, but it is done. And it will be counted election night because it's already there, bundled up, and brought to the office.
Yep. So you can go to your county courthouse and vote before voting day. You can register for mail-in voting, a mail ballot.
Yep.
You can do
It's called
that.
absentee. So it just means you're not going to be voting in person.
And Montana also has what's called the electronic ballot request system, where you can request a ballot be sent to you electronically, fill it out, and mail it back.
Right.
It's kind of like an add-on to absentee voting. It's it's similar to that.
But you got to have a printer, right?
Yeah.
And like, who these days has a printer at home? But it is what I like about it too is it's electronic and it may be easier to navigate or read given your screen reading devices. So it gives different accessible options. But also, if you're going to vote in person, there are accessible voting machines, and you can ask to use one, and you can put headphones on and it will read it to you. And then you can select using, I don't know if we have the rollerball one here. I haven't.
Express
physically-
vote is what we've got here.
And there's you can interface with the machine, so you're not just telling another person. If you can't see or you can't mark it yourself with your hand, you're not telling another person. Could you mark, I'm voting for this person, this person, this person, but instead do it privately, so you have your private right of vote.
And I believe we've got an older video before we started this podcast about the express vote. I'll either put it in a card or in the description below.
Great. And we've been talking a lot about November, but voting does happen at other times too. So there are, your school district may not have a vote this May, but if it does have a vote, there's a May 7th cutoff for voting on school district issues. There's June 4th is the primary vote. That's to take, let's say there are 15 people running for an office, to shorten that up to usually 2 people. And so that's primary day is on the 4th. Sometimes, I don't know if we do this here, but if like there's an uncontested like judge election, sometimes if they get enough votes, then there's no race later. I don't know if we do that.
That happened actually for some county commission seat
so,
or city and county seats, something. Yeah, there are uncontested vote. If there's an uncontested vote, there's no one even on the ballot to vote, and they just get the seat.
So yet another plug. Go out there and run. Like, we're talking about voting, but you can also engage that way. And then November 5th this year is the general election, and that's the big one everyone will be talking about from here until then.
Yes. So if you have any questions about voting, please call our office, email us, hit us up in the comments. We're around to help with all voting information, and there will be more voting events and voter information coming out from our office throughout the spring, summer, and as we head toward November. So be aware of those things, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.